In talking to your subordinates, there's a simple rule of thumb that works. Talk to those who work for you the same way you want your boss to talk to you. In large organizations, there are often formal employee evaluations, stating goals and objectives for each member of your staff. In a smaller one, the process may be handled less formally. But formal or not, such reviews are intended to accomplish exactly what we're talking about here, to guarantee that you talk to each of your employees on a regular schedule and tell them what kind of job they're doing, where you think they can do better, and what specifically you'd like for them to concentrate on in the following evaluation period. Personnel management people will tell you that the evaluation meeting to go over these points is also supposed to be a two-way street, that you should be willing to listen to what your employee has to say about you, the strong and weak points of the office's operation, and your role in it, and what they think you can and should do to make things run even better. Periodic evaluation meetings with members of your staff are only one method of communicating to your employees, not just talking to them. But don't just do this every 6 months. In the day-to-day working atmosphere, tell your employees how they're doing. Give clear instructions. If time is a factor, make sure they understand that and give them a deadline. Encourage them to ask questions so you can be sure that they understand. Be generous with your praise for good work. If you're unhappy with something, tell them. Don't avoid a confrontation by hoping the problem will dry up and blow away or solve itself. And don't postpone action for a week while your blood pressure goes through the top of your head and you wind up exploding at the employee. This is the Stone Age way of treating grown-ups, including those who work for you, and frequently causes a permanent rupture in your working relationship with that employee and the rest of your staff, too. Don't play games with your staff members either by expressing your displeasure to another subordinate of yours and using them to convey your message for you. Have the professionalism, the integrity, and the guts to do it yourself. The employees who used to be called secretaries or even Girl Fridays, why do I get the feeling I'm dating myself, are more often called assistants now. But whatever title they prefer, such employees are the secret weapon in many offices, the link that makes the whole operation successful. They save time, they get things done more effectively, not only for their bosses, but also their coworkers, and they can do the same for you. In my own case, people who work with me know that Judith Thomas, my personal assistant and one of my associate producers on the Larry King Live staff, is the first person to talk to about matters involving my schedule. Someone could spend a week trying to get me on the phone, but in almost every case, Judy can field that question herself and work you onto the calendar, a talent of which she is a genius. Show that you respect your assistant's competence and knowledge. A good assistant is an asset to any organization and deserves to be treated accordingly. Not only that, it's just being smart. An assistant who feels appreciated and gets talked to in the right professional way is going to go out of his or her way to help you and will move mountains to get things done for you. Negotiating is often a critical area of business talk. In addition to his many other talents, my friend Herb Cohen is a professional negotiator. He travels 200 days a year handling negotiations for the largest corporations in America. His book, You Can Negotiate Anything, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 9 months and was a bestseller in Australia for 3 years. He was an advisor to Presidents Carter and Reagan on counterterrorism. Herbie knows from negotiating. One of his first and greatest successes came at an early age when we were 9th graders at Bensonhurst Junior High School, ready to move on to Lafayette High. It's a textbook case, so to speak, of how you can turn a potential defeat into a victory in negotiations by making sure you talk from a position of strength, even when the odds are stacked high against you. 3 of us, Herb Cohen, Brazia Batty, and I, had a classmate named Gil Mermelstein called Moppo because he had such a thick head of red hair it looked like a mop. One day we discovered that he and his family had quickly moved to Arizona after Moppo developed tuberculosis. We took care of notifying the school. But Herb hatched a scheme where instead of telling them Moppo had moved, we would tell him Moppo died, collect money for flowers, and spend it all on hot dogs and soft drink at Nathan's, our favorite hangout. Unfortunately, our scheme succeeded too well. After the principal's office called Moppo's home and found his number had indeed been disconnected, the school mourned him enthusiastically, furnishing us with the loot for a massive feast at Nathan's. But it didn't stop there. The principal, Dr. Irving Cohen, no relation to Herbie, decided to establish the Gil Mermelstein Memorial Award for each year's outstanding student. Singled us out for praise in honoring Mappo's memory the way we did with our collection. Mappo showed up at his own eulogy. As Dr. Cohen is praising Mappo's memory and our good deed, Mappo chooses that day and that minute to walk into the back of the auditorium. He was much better, thank you, and registering for the fall. Herbie jumps to his feet, cups his hands to his mouth, and yells, "Mappo, go home, you're dead!" Our fellow students, smelling a rat, break up in laughter. Dr. Cohen is not amused. What followed was teenage tension in its blackest moments, but also a triumph in negotiating. Dr. Cohen orders us to his office and proceeds to do the talking. "The three of you are suspended for life. You will never graduate. Not this year, not next year, not any year. You have pulled the most despicable act I have ever seen in a school." As Brazzy and I ponder life in prison with no parole, Herbie takes the offensive. He says to the principal, "Wait a minute, Doc. You are making a big mistake." "What'd you say?" "You're really going to kill your career if you do this." Dr. Cohen says, "What do you mean?" Herb continues, "It's true, we won't graduate, but how about you?" Then he moves in for the kill. "If you suspend us, there's going to be a hearing. At the hearing, one of the questions will be why you took the word of 3 13-year-old boys who told you someone was dead. Why didn't you check the story out?" Dr. Cohen says, "We did check." Herbie continues, still brazenly calling him Doc instead of Doctor for his Ph.D. degree. "Shouldn't you have done more than that, Doc? You made one phone call, the operator said the phone was disconnected, and on the basis of that one phone call you wrote deceased on his records? We have a bad disciplinary record already, and you make one phone call?" Then Herb made his closing argument. "Doc, we may be suspended, but you're out of work." Then, after pausing for effect, he says calmly, "Why don't we forget the whole thing?" Herb's negotiations were successful, resulting in a complete victory for all three of us, his first clients. Dr. Cohen agreed to forget the incident, and he also let us graduate. Whatever you might be negotiating for, my advice, based on personal experience, is to talk the language of Bob Wolf. It's no accident that Bob represented some of the greatest names in American entertainment, sports, and news media. Clients came to him and adversaries respected him because he spoke the same way he dealt, with integrity, professionalism, and humor. That's why I was always proud to tell people my agent is Bob Wolf. I always felt that it spoke well of me to be able to say that someone as respected as Bob represented me. Bob never spoke in threats or with hostility. He considered the party we were negotiating with to be our worthy adversary, but not our mortal enemy. He spoke to them the same way. He never believed in telling the Boston Celtics, "If you don't give Larry Bird what he wants, I'll tell him not to report to training camp." He didn't believe in walking out on a contract or even threatening to. He never told Ted Turner, "If you don't give us what we're asking for, you will have to air a rerun of Larry King Live tonight because I will see he is not there." He was perfectly willing, however, to make it clear that we had other options, and did on many occasions, but he never used the sledgehammer approach in which you threaten to destroy the other party. That wasn't Bob's nature, and it wasn't his way. He never believed in costly short-term victories. He used to remind me that if you make a few more bucks in the short run, but you've permanently alienated the other side, this will be the last contract you'll ever get out of them. That your victory is shallow, short-term. Herb Cohen has that same philosophy. That's my final advice on how to talk during negotiations, from my own experience and my frequent conversations with many experts. Keep your fences mended so you can win again the next time. That's one of the many lessons to be learned from these two highly successful negotiators. If you do what they do and talk their talk, as I've been able to describe that to you in this section, you'll be successful today and tomorrow too. Everybody likes to complain about meetings, so somebody needs to stick up for them. There's this much to be said about meetings. When several people have to make decisions or plan how to get something achieved, a good meeting is the best and most efficient way to do it. A bad meeting, as we all know, is torture. A few simple points about meetings. When you're a participant, the best way to save time is simple. Don't go. If your presence is not really necessary, ask to be excused or invent a conflicting engagement. If you do go, an important guideline to remember is the less said, the better. Once you're there, if you are not involved in a topic under discussion, avoid the temptation to jump into the conversation just for the sake of being noticed. Be willing to ask dumb questions. Meetings have a tendency to develop sort of a bandwagon personality when one person states a certain premise early in the meeting and everybody else around the table spends the rest of the meeting jumping on the bandwagon. What you need then is someone who is willing to stop the runaway bandwagon by injecting a much-needed question like, "But isn't the emperor going to get cold standing there naked?" Now, if you know ahead of time that you're expected to speak, or if you feel strongly about wanting to say something in particular, make notes beforehand. Don't wing it. If you do, I can guarantee you'll talk too long and risk losing the support of your colleagues around the table. The reason you'll run longer is simply that you will digress. You'll hem, you'll haw, you'll say, too many times, and in general, will make it a far less effective presentation. By all means, don't be afraid to use humor. Meetings cry out for a laugh once in a while, especially if they're dragging on and no one is willing to adjourn the deliberations. I know a man in Washington who suffered through a long and boring meeting on the growing practice of converting rental apartments into condominiums in the early 80s. After the meeting dragged well beyond the productive point and seeing that the executive director was unwilling to wield the gavel, this guy says with a straight face, "As a Roman Catholic, I'm opposed to the use of condominiums." Whereupon the meeting broke up. When you're running the meeting, you will do well to remember what they say in the real estate business. The three most important things are location, location, and location. The three most important things in running a meeting are preparation, preparation, and preparation. So have an agenda, even if it's an informal one, consisting of just a few notes in front of you to make sure you cover what you want to cover in that meeting. This will considerably enhance your chances of meeting your objective by coming out of the meeting with what you want. Your prospects of having a successful meeting start with your own preparation. Then there are these other helpful hints. First, start on time. It sounds basic, but think of how many meetings you've been to that didn't. Let the small talk get finished in the hallway before and after the meeting. If you allow last night's football game to be the first subject of discussion at the table, you have no momentum for a brisk, decisive, productive meeting. The same applies to letting people drift in for the first 10 or 15 minutes. Then, be decisive. You've established what the issues are. The last question for each item is, what action is to be taken, who's going to do it? If you leave this vague, there was no point in having the meeting in the first place. And finally, be firm. Don't let others waste time or try to score points on each other. You don't have to chide them. Let the clock do it. Just say, "Sorry, Pete, we got to move on to the next item." There's no reason for you to be afraid of seeming bossy or brusque. Relax. If you can run a short meeting and get decisions made, you'll earn far more gratitude and goodwill than you would be letting everybody ramble and then presiding over a failed meeting. That helps you in no way. Somebody tells you you have to give a speech. Your response may be, "I got to do what?" But it's important to remember that speeches are like anything else in life. There's always a first time. People, even some who are wonderful talkers in a conversational setting, are often terrified over the prospect of giving their first speech. Some are scared about it regardless of how many they give. We seem to believe that there's some kind of mystique to public speaking, some secret knowledge that makes a person a good speaker. There are so many books on the subject, you'd think you needed a graduate degree before you could stand at a lectern. I give speeches many times a year to groups of every possible description. My secret is simply that I think of public speaking as no different from any other form of talk. It's a way of sharing my thoughts with other people. In one sense, it's easier than social conversation because you are in complete control of where the talk is going. At the same time, you have to have something to say. You can't fudge it with, "Oh, really, tell me more." And saying you have to go to the bathroom does not get you out of this one. This leads to the first key to being a successful public speaker. Talk about something you know about. Find a subject that you know about, or take a personal approach to a broader subject. If your church group or synagogue asks you to give a talk on your trip to the Holy Land, don't try to make a grand summary of the meaning of the Israeli-PLO peace treaty. Tell about what you saw and how the political situation affected people you met and talked to. I guarantee you'll be more comfortable and your listeners will find it a lot more interesting. When I made my first speech at the age of 13, I picked a subject that was very close to me. It was my bar mitzvah, the coming-of-age ceremony for a Jewish boy. We didn't have much money then. My father had just died 3 years before, and my mother was in the process of working hard to get us off welfare, which she accomplished shortly thereafter. But she made sure my brother and I had our bar mitzvahs. On those occasions, the young man being honored is required to make a speech. I had never stood up in front of an audience before, except during those recitals and book reports that every kid gives in school. But this was a real audience, with grown-ups yet. At 13, you're not an expert on very many things, so I decided to talk about one of the things I knew the most about: my father. Most everybody in the audience had known him, and I shared my memories with them. I recalled my walks and talks with my father down Howard Avenue to Saratoga Park, where he would buy me ice cream. I told my audience that our talks there were more fun and more important to me than the park itself or the ice cream. He talked to me about the Yankees with Joe DiMaggio, about going to Lou Gehrig's funeral. He'd asked me what I learned in Hebrew school that day, and he told me how glad he was to be in America, not in Russia, where he had emigrated from when he was 20 years old. Some of the adults said nice things to me after I finished my speech, and I found I had enjoyed sharing my memories with them. It was one of the experiences that convinced me I wanted to talk for a living. The second key to being a good speaker is to follow the motto of the Boy Scouts: be prepared. If you're talking about a subject you know well, as I've just advised, preparing the speech itself should not be too difficult. You will be able to organize your thoughts more easily and more effectively if you bear in mind this simple structure for speeches. 1, tell them what you're going to tell them. 2, tell them. 3, tell them what you've told them. If you let the audience know where you're going at the beginning, they'll follow you more easily through the body of your speech. At the end, try to summarize your most important points in slightly different words from the ones you used in the opening. I'm lucky because I give speeches often enough I don't have to spend much time in preparation. When I'm asked to speak these days, the audience usually wants to know about a subject I'm very familiar with. But unless you're giving a speech on a topic you've already spoken about before, preparation is a must. You can prepare any number of ways, whichever way works best for you. You can write your speech out word for word, read it from the text. Many speakers do that. If you follow this approach, be sure to practice reading your speech enough so you can look at your audience frequently, and you don't spend the entire speech with your eyes on the paper in front of you. Others prefer speaking from an outline, typed on standard 8.5 by 11 typing paper. Still others are most comfortable with notes on file cards. The advantage of using notes is that you tend to speak with more spontaneity and you don't fall into that trap of staring down at a script. But speaking is like body language and dressing. Whatever you're most comfortable with is what you should do. Now, whether you use a script or notes, you should practice your speech several times to get familiar with the content, become comfortable with the style and the pacing. You can read it in front of a mirror or ask a coworker or someone in your family to be the audience for this rehearsal. It's a good idea to time yourself as you're rehearsing. Your speech may take much more or much less time than you think while you're writing it. You should find out how much time you're allotted before you speak and adjust your speech in rehearsal as necessary to fill that time. Here are some other key tips based on my own speaking experience and what I've noticed in other good speakers. Look at your audience. I've already said how important it is to make eye contact. First, be sure to look up from your text or notes. Second, don't talk to the wall in the back of the window or the side. They are not the audience. Each time you look up from your text, look at a different part of the audience so the whole group feels they're being addressed. Know the pacing and inflection you want to use. Some speakers, if they're reading from a complete text, underline the words they want to emphasize. If you're using an outline or notes, highlight ideas or phrases you should stress. This accomplishes two things. It guarantees your emphasis will be where you intended it to be, and it assures the audience that you won't be speaking in a dull monotone that'll put them to sleep, especially if you're talking after a meal. Stand up straight. I don't mean you have to assume a parade ground posture, but stand in a comfortable way rather than hunching over the lectern. Hunching constricts your breathing, and it looks bad. If there's a microphone in front of you, adjust it to the right height or ask a technician to do it, rather than forcing yourself to stoop like a heron. If you can, check this out before it's your turn to speak. Talk normally into the microphone. That's why it's there. If you declaim at a high volume into it, you'll actually be harder to hear. And be careful to keep your mouth in range of the mic. Don't weave around or turn away to answer a question from the side. Now, unless you're announcing a cure for cancer or declaring war, it helps to remember that speeches are considered by some to be the curse of mankind. Don't stay serious if you don't have to, and even if you're talking on a serious subject, most listeners welcome shots of humor. Suppose you're talking to a group of business executives about strategies and how to carry them out. This is one of my favorite stories on that subject. Will Rogers said he had a plan for ending World War I. He used to say, as I see it, the problem is caused by all them German submarines, the U-boats, sinking our boats. I propose we heat the Atlantic Ocean to the boiling point. Then, when the ocean gets too hot for them German subs to stay underwater, they'll have to come to the surface. And when they do, we'll be waiting for them and pick them off one by one, just like we do during hunting season back home in Oklahoma. Then Rogers added, "Of course, you might ask me how I'm going to heat the Atlantic Ocean to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and my answer is, I leave it to technicians. Me, I'm a policy man." After the laughter dies down, you draw the connection between the story and the point you're making. You tell your audience, now that's the difference between setting policy and implementing it. Here's an example on the subject of problem solving, a serious concern with many business and professional audiences. You can quote the genius of my friend Jackie Gleason on that subject. He had a proposal for solving the traffic problem in New York City. Make all the streets one-way north, then let Albany worry about it. After the laughter, you relate the joke to the point you're making by adding, Gleason's approach is a good reminder not to make your problem-solving approaches more complicated than necessary. If you remember that public speaking is just a modified form of conversation and talk in your natural style, you know people are going to understand you. They will feel you're talking to them, not over their heads. Don't go too far the other way and try to be too colloquial. Even in this permissive 90s, four-letter words and other examples of appealing to the lowest common denominator in your audience hurt you a whole lot more than they may help you. If you're a Marine whose everyday talk is full of expletives, here's where to adjust your normal speech. Even if a given listener doesn't mind that you say damn, he's going to be uncomfortable if he knows that your language is bothering, say, his grandmother across the aisle. It's a different matter if you know your audience intimately, say you're talking to your platoon. But unless that's the case, err on the side of decorum in your speech. Keep in mind the value of brevity. English teachers tell the story of the man who received a lengthy letter from a friend who ended with an apology. "Please excuse such a long letter," his friend said. "I didn't have time to write a short one." It's not easy to be brief, especially on a topic you know a lot about. But in any kind of communication, it's always worth taking the time to boil your message down to its essentials. That emphasis on brevity applies even more when you're delivering a speech. The show business expression, know when to get off, comes into play again. And the best public speakers always know when. Abraham Lincoln knew it. His Gettysburg Address lasted less than 5 minutes. He was preceded on that November day in 1863 by one of the most popular orators of the time, Edward Everett. He spoke for 2 hours. We know which speech is remembered today. Everett knew greatness when he heard it. He later wrote to Lincoln, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I come as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Some of the longest speeches ever inflicted on the American public have been the inaugural addresses of our presidents. However, one of the shortest inaugural addresses is also one of the best remembered and most often quoted. It was delivered January 20th, 1961 by John F. Kennedy. The new president offered a challenge to Americans as they moved into a new decade following the 50s, which many considered a lethargic time. Carl Sandburg, the eminent author, poet, and historian who won the Pulitzer Prize for his account of Lincoln's presidency, told friends of his admiration for the Kennedy inaugural address. He said, "It's Lincoln-esque." Kennedy spoke for less than 15 minutes. Most of us will never find ourselves in the position of leader of the free world, but our speeches are important to ourselves and to our audiences. We can learn from these speakers whose ability to talk effectively was central to their success, as is the case with so many successful people in every profession. Brevity's the first thing we can learn from them. If people like Lincoln and Kennedy are willing to keep it short to maximize their effectiveness as speakers, we should be smart enough to do the same thing. These great speakers also adhered to another fundamental rule of good speaking. It's summarized in the expression KISS, KISS. It means, keep it simple, stupid. There are no 50-cent words, no trendy talk, no convoluted sentences, no technical terms in these moving speeches by these two world figures. Follow their example, and even if you are no Kennedy, you'll get your message across. That's what makes an effective speaker. If you become successful at speaking in public, the next thing that might befall you is to find yourself being asked to appear on radio or TV. Don't panic. I think of my nightly CNN show as a conversation that happens to be in front of a camera. I don't think of it as a confrontation. In this, I differ from some other interviews like Sam Donaldson. I don't feel you have to come at your guest in attack mode or like a prosecuting attorney to get a solid, substantive answer. I prefer to be civil about it, to engage my guest on a personal level, in so doing to conduct an interview that is both informative and interesting viewing. Careful listening and persistent questioning are often the key. I was doing my Miami radio show on the Surfside 6 nightclub boat when Joe DiMaggio Jr. walked in with a friend. My guest was Bill Hardtack, the Hall of Fame jockey. After interviewing Bill, Joe Jr. came onto the show and we talked for half an hour about his life as the son and namesake of one of the most famous people in America. As we talked, we moved logically, almost naturally, into the subject of his relationship with his father. Finally, I asked him the most fundamental question that can be asked of a human being about his parents. Do you love your father? Joe Jr. thought for a very long time. I love what he's done. Do you love him? Again silence. And then, I don't know him. I'm sure Joe had his side of that story about his relationship with his son. If he were to come on my show, I would give him the opportunity to talk about it. But knowing Joe's rigid refusal to talk about his personal life, I'm sure he would decline the invitation. If my question about his father had been the first one I'd asked Joe DiMaggio Jr., he probably would have given a standard answer like, of course. But when I came to it after a comfortable time, as part of a reasonable and discreet conversation, he gave a much more honest and more poignant answer. However, your first experience with a broadcast interview is more likely to feature you as the interviewee rather than the host. Think of the Boy Scouts again and be prepared. In any interview, the first secret of success is to make sure you control the interview, not the other person, whether it's a job interview or a newspaper story or you on the radio. You can gain control by making certain you have a thorough knowledge of the subject, and then reminding yourself that you know more about it than the person across the desk or microphone from you. If it's a news interview, remember, there's nothing in the United States Constitution that requires you to answer every question, or to go into as much detail as your questioner might like, or even to be interviewed in the first place. And as in so many other things, diverting the question with humor when you've been put on the spot often makes the interview successful. You can't be forced into answering anybody's questions, including mine, unless you're sitting as a witness in a courtroom or giving a deposition in a court case. And even in a judicial proceeding, if you can't remember something, don't let the fact that you're so nervous lead you into giving an answer that won't stand up in later testimony by you or others. If you don't remember, say so. They can never send you to jail for not being able to remember something. If you weren't there, say so. But remember this, if you were there and you say you weren't, you're asking for trouble. Public humiliation or worse, legal penalties. Always tell the truth, obviously, and never be afraid to say you don't remember, if that's the truth. If you're being interviewed in any other setting, including news interviews, don't worry about the questions. If you don't like the question, you can divert it any number of ways, even on Larry King Live, corporate executives, government officials, celebrities, even my own colleagues in broadcasting. Employ some of the following ways of getting out of answering a question they don't like, for one legitimate reason or another. For example, it would be premature for me to answer that question now, or I'm not able to answer that question because I haven't seen the report yet. One of the worst answers in a news interview is no comment. That used to work. although never very well. It doesn't work at all now. In this litigious society and with the tabloid mentality that seems to be overtaking this society, or at least disturbingly significant portions of it, no comment now implies guilt. If he wasn't guilty, he wouldn't say no comment. He'd answer the question. The only time you hear it anymore is in a badly written television or movie script. What if you know in advance that you're walking into an uncomfortable situation, but you have to do it anyway? What then? Answer, be honest. Example, Tylenol. When it was learned in the 80s that someone had tampered with Tylenol's product by lacing its capsules with poison, the manufacturer Johnson & Johnson took the straight-up attitude rather than trying to minimize the impact of what it had found or by trying to stage a cover-up. Officials went before the television cameras and apologized to the American consumers. Their public relations approach, in essence, was not to use a public relations approach. They told the truth. This awful thing has happened, but our product remains safe. We've taken extraordinary new precautions to minimize the possibility that could ever happen again, and you can continue to buy Tylenol without fear. The result was that public confidence in that product was restored, and the company won respect all over the country for its forthrightness. Here are 5 tips that I've picked up from my own experiences and from talking to others in broadcasting that will help you survive and succeed on radio and television. First, stick with what makes you comfortable. One of the secrets for a successful performance in representing yourself, your company, or your organization on radio or television is to make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing. And if you don't want to be interviewed, don't. Second, stay current. Remain young in the sense that you stay current. Know what TV shows and movies are popular, who the favorite singers and actors are. Have a working familiarity, not necessarily an expert's knowledge, on the stories of the day and what news people are talking about. In the 50s and 60s and later, we had to know a little something about the Cold War. Now we have to know about its end. We used to need to be conversant about the Soviet Union. Now we also have to be able to talk, to some extent, about Bosnia. That's one of the major reasons President Clinton has appeared on MTV. Clinton agrees to go on that show not just to stay current, but to show he's current, that he knows the interests and concerns of America's youth. Third, avoid negatives. Don't worry that you might not do well. If you concentrate on negatives, your performance will be negative. Remind yourself that your appearance on this show or your answers in the interview, although they may be important to you and maybe to many others, will probably not change the course of civilization as we know it. John Lowenstein, a talented Major League Baseball player for 16 years and now a broadcaster for the Baltimore Orioles telecasts, was once asked by a reporter about his failure to lay down a bunt at a decisive point in that night's Orioles game. Lowenstein told the reporter, "Look, there are 1 billion people living in China, and tomorrow morning, not one of them will know that I missed that bunt." So, relax. Fourth, approach radio and TV the same way. On television, your appearance is important. On radio, it isn't. Beyond that, approach them the same way. I'm a communicator, a verbal communicator. I look at my guests on radio the same way I look at them on television. On TV, I let the camera follow me. I don't follow it. Because appearance is not important on radio, I often wear jeans. Never on television. And fifth, improve your voice and look your best. On both radio and television, your voice is important. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. Your speaking voice projects distinction and authority. I'm lucky to have been born with what is considered a good voice for broadcasting. I've never had to worry about it. But if I didn't have the voice I've been given, I would seek to improve it, even if I never went on the air for anything. It's too much of a factor in success. It has been said that President Clinton would project a more persuasive image if he had a stronger, deeper voice, although I don't know how anyone could be more impressive on television than he is. He's our best TV president since Kennedy, and I include Reagan. In any profession, if I thought my voice could stand improving, I would find a voice teacher there in every city, or read books in the library, or do both. I know from others in broadcasting that voice training works, and so do voice exercises. No matter what the quality of your voice is like, your delivery is very important. If you sound too much like Don Knotts, or if people tell you you don't talk loud enough, or you talk too fast, work on it. Slow yourself down, which will in turn calm you down. The best way to do that is to get used to the sound of your own voice. And that's another key ingredient in determining your success or failure on radio and television. The first time you heard yourself on a tape recording, even if it was only to record the message on your telephone answering machine, when you played it back, I know what you said. I sound awful. The truth of the matter is that everyone thinks and says the same thing the first time they hear their own voice. So, if you're going to go on radio and television, you should make sure you're comfortable with the sound of your voice. How? By talking out loud the same way many speakers do in rehearsing a speech. Practice answering imaginary questions, or have someone conduct a dry run with you, the same way experienced leaders in business and government do before they appear on a broadcast or at a press conference. Get used to what you sound like and develop your own pace in speaking, one that comes naturally to you and helps to make you more comfortable. You'll feel much calmer and more assured when you go on the air, which will greatly enhance your chances for a successful, persuasive performance. When you're on television, your appearance becomes extremely important because you're representing not only someone else but yourself, too. So you want to wear a good-looking suit or dress and make sure you're well-groomed, even down to such basics as clean fingernails. If your hair looks great, and so does the rest of you, you will represent yourself and your organization effectively, especially on TV. Some people are afraid that with so much information being carried on in so many electronic media, the art of conversation is going to become obsolete. I'd say exactly the opposite. We're talking more than ever, and in more ways than ever, because of all those new devices. But conversation will be with us as long as there are humans. And with all the inventions and Star Wars developments before us, success will always come back to the basics. Whether you are sitting across a table from somebody or typing messages across a computer network, the principles of good talk are the same. It's all about making a connection with the other person. Openness, enthusiasm, and a willingness to listen will make you a popular conversationalist in any medium. And whether you're talking to 12 people in a community center or giving a satellite teleconference, it's the same with addressing a group. Preparation, knowing your audience, keeping it simple, will always make you a successful speaker. If there's one thing I hope you get out of this tape, it's an attitude about talk. Talk should not be a challenge, a grim obligation, or a way of filling up time. Talk is mankind's greatest invention. It's how we make connections. It's one of the pleasures that life has to offer. Think of every conversation as an opportunity. Regardless of your ability as a talker, remember this. 1, if you feel you're not good at it, you can be. And 2, if you feel you are good at it, you can be better. Keep talking.
This has been a Random House Audiobooks presentation.